by watching this short video, you're going to learn how to program an object-oriented class. But before we start programming, we're going to understand what it is we're programming. So this diagram is a entity relationship diagram, a kind of a database diagram of a typical kind of username and password authentication system used by most e-commerce sites. So we have a user object right here, and this user object, what he does is that he's going to keep track of the emails and passwords of all the people who sign in. And then we have the profile object. The profile object keeps track of everything that the site keeps track of, such as the first name, the last name. A lot of sites will ask you for your address, your birthday, your gender, and maybe some other things as well. So we are going to be programming the profile class for the purposes of this video. The profile class contains the user ID that it links back to. This is what's known as a foreign key. And during the database lesson, you learn more about foreign keys. So which user ID is managing this profile? Well, it's going to be that one over there. That's what the user ID does. It's pretty much a bridge back to the user. Profile ID is what's known as the primary key. The primary key is basically the first profile that had ever been created is profile number 1. The second profile is profile number 2. The third profile, profile number 3, blah, blah, blah. The important thing to know about a primary key is that it's the unique identifier and that it's an integer. Now the first name and the last name is just kind of your basic profile data. Again, most e-commerce sites are going to ask for more than just your name, but without loss of generality, we can keep it down to 2 fields here for the sake of simplicity. So the first thing we should understand here before we start coding is, what do these fields look like? Let's see. Is there any rule that governs how first names and last names should look like? No. No, definitely not. People's names are people's names, and that's that. And so we're just going to store these as generic free-form strings. That's all we need to know for now. Now, profile ID and user ID, what data type are they? Well, let's see. The first profile ever created is 1. The second profile ever created is 2, and the third one is 3. Now, if we go back to user for a second, the first user that was ever created was 1. The second user was 2. The third user was 3. Same pattern. So what's the lowest number here? 1. What's the highest number? We don't know. So what we're going to say here is that these are going to be integer. Greater than 0. That's important. So these are going to be an integer greater than 0 here. These user ID and the profile ID. And the first name and the last name are going to be strings. So now that we understand our data types, we're almost ready to start coding. The second thing we need to understand before we start coding is something called encapsulation. So I'm going to go over encapsulation real fast. Encapsulation is basically the idea of hiding your data and not allowing direct access to it. Essentially, the data is the gold. It's the currency. It really is. Data is the currency of the web. And so we're going to put in some protections to make sure people can't just arbitrarily change our data and manipulate our data at will. We don't want them to do that. We want to make sure we can place some safeguards and some safety protections against people who are trying to tamper with our data or access data they really don't have the right to access. In both cases, we can use encapsulation to this. Encapsulation is basically saying, look, in object-oriented programming, we're going to pretty much put method as kind of a gatekeeper to data. Now, a method is written out as a function within a class, and we're going to be writing methods shortly here. And so the methods are the only way you can put something in, that's the input, and the only way you can take something out, that's the output. And that's the only way you can affect the data, is through the methods. As you can see, this little encapsulation diagram is a fortress. There's no way in, no way out. not without going through a method first. And we're going to take advantage of this and make our data very secure by using methods in a moment. So, now that we understand what it is we're programming and what encapsulation is, we can get started. So, we'll start off a blank PHP page here. Okay, now the first thing I'm going to put is what's known as a doc block. Now, a doc block is basically automated documentation. Now, by automated documentation, I mean it's a special comment block that tells us all about what we're writing. This is very important, and this is something that is going to be required not only in the class, but also in the real world. This is essential to being a vital team member in which you write documentation for your code as you go along. That's the idea. So the first part of the doc block when you write a class is a one-line description of the class. So there's my short little title for the class, typical profile for an e-commerce site. And then I skip a line, and the next part is going to be a more detailed description of what the class does. You really want to tell your reader immediately what you're doing. So and then the last part is give yourself a little credit. And we're going to use something called a doc block tag, which starts with an @ and then you say, well, author. Now in the author tag, you actually just put your real name and your email. Okay. That's a complete doc block before the class. I always start off with this documentation because it focuses me and says, okay, this is what I'm about to program. This is what I'm about to do. The challenge to programming, as you'll find, is not the programming itself, but understanding what you're doing and understanding what you're programming. Let me label the doc block real fast, and we'll get on to the class. So right here, this is going to be, when you render this from the doc block generator, we use something called doxygen. This will actually be rendered in an H1 tag. So as you recall, the H1 tag is a very large title text, and so that's why this should be very short to the point as to what this is doing. This will be labeled in a P tag, and this is going to go right under the H1 tag. So basically what we're doing is that we're writing comments here that are going to automatically generate a web page that will document this class and tell us everything about everything we want to know about this object. And then this one will kind of go right below the P tag, and so it's going to be kind of footnoted in the documentation. It's still in there, it's still important, and indeed you'll get an A tag here for the email. So the important point of doc blocks is to remember that there are certain parts of it, and also to remember that you're really trying to communicate to other developers what you're doing. This first doc block is kind of like writing the introduction to the class and introducing other developers to what the class is all about. So now that we have the documentation up, we can actually start coding. So we're going to start off with the keyword class. Now after the keyword class comes the name of the class, and then we get some braces. Now, I cannot overemphasize, oh my God, these braces, they need to be here first up. If you don't include these braces, you're in bad shape. Because if you miss one of these braces, they are very, very hard to reinsert into your code. You can easily get lost and get a lot of superfluous errors, and that I don't want you to be buried in. So form good habits now, and every time you create your class, put some braces along with the empty body. All right. Now the next part, we're going to actually go ahead and put all the variables that we had over here in this diagram in the order that they appear. Now, for every state variable, we're actually going to put a mini doc block for it. You're going to find this actually as we continue to go along. We're going to continue to write doc blocks along with whatever we write. That should be an expectation you should have at all times. If you ever put something into a class, you're going to write a doc block for it. So we're going to, again, stay in good habits. So the first thing that I remember was profile ID. Now, profile ID, as you recall, was a primary key. Whenever I have a primary key in a class, I will always explicitly put this is the primary key. That way the other developers aren't guessing, well, was that the primary key? It kind of looks like it could have been, but maybe he named it something. No, put it in the doc block. That way there's no argument and no contest. The next thing I'm going to put is the user ID. So the user ID is pretty much which user owns this profile. And this is what's known as a foreign key. Again, a foreign key kind of was like a bridge back to the user table. And again, just like with the primary keys, I always explicitly label my foreign keys this way. There's no guesswork involved. Now, we're going to rinse and repeat for the first and last name. Perfect. Now we have what are known as the state variables. All these right here in object-oriented are what are known as the state variables. The state variables are the physical, tangible part of the class. This is the part of the class that will actually be occupying memory eventually. And this is the stuff that will actually be in the database. This is the stuff the user can touch, feel, manipulate, look, and see. Now, going back to the idea of encapsulation, we have pretty much right now circled out our data right now. But all we have is data. We have no layers of methods protecting anything. We don't have these yet. So we're actually going to create for the data and the input method was going to be known as a mutator. And the mutator method is basically a safeguard method. The mutator methods will contain safeguards to make sure nobody's out to contaminate our database and nobody's out to get us. And the output method is known as the accessor. The accessor method is just basically a safe way of accessing what is currently in our data without allowing somebody to run away and manipulate it. So let's go ahead and program those up. We're going to need 8 methods, 2 per state variable. So away we go. So I'm going to start a method, and just like everything else in object-oriented, I'm going to start with a doc block. So for a method, we don't have to worry about the level of detail and the level of complexity that we had here. We can just put our one-line description and just say accessor method for profile ID. Okay. Before I move on, we have a new tag here. It's called return. Return, what it says is, okay, this method is going to be returning something. We're going to be giving back. We're going to let you read a part of my state. And so when I let you read a part of my state, I'm going to return it to you. And so that's what that means. And then int is the type that we can expect. Int for integer. And then the rest of the words, the rest of the words that follow the type is just an explanation of what you can expect. This way the developer says, oh, the value of profile ID. Okay, that makes sense. He's going to give me the profile ID. Great. So public function. So every method will have the word public, which is the encapsulation level. And then function is just a keyword. And then the method name, which is get profile ID and parentheses and braces. Okay. This right here is the function or the method name. Get profile ID. Now, accessor methods are going to are always going to start with this word get, because that's what accessor methods are all about. We're going to go out into the object and get something and then bring it back to you. And we're going to return it to you. And indeed, it's one line of code. All we have to do is return this profile ID. Now, one little word on this. This will be covered in detail in class, but essentially what it is saying, okay, which object am I working with? Am I working with a foreign object? Am I working with an object that was just created, an object that was passed to me? No, I'm working within myself. I'm looking deep within myself, within my own object, and this is a special keyword that gives me that just basically says I'm talking to myself. Honestly. Okay. Now, I will write a mutator method for profile ID. The idea of the mutator method is to allow for a person to set a new ID for the profile. I'm going to make out the doc block here and then explain it. Okay, this doc block is a little more in depth than we saw. So let's break it out. First part is a one-line description of what this method is supposed to do. It's a mutator method for profile ID, which means I can pass in another profile ID, manipulate it, and change it. The next one is called param, short for parameter. Parameter, it's what we're going to be putting in. It's a placeholder. Now, what kind of parameter we have? Integer. Okay, an int. And then the name of our parameter is called new profile ID. and then we explain what it does. So basically, again, at param means a parameter, something we're going to be putting into the method. Throws, this means we're going to be throwing an exception. Now, an exception essentially is just what happens when things go wrong. What's the worst that could happen? Well, this is what is the worst that can happen. That's why they're called exceptions. They handle exceptional cases that shouldn't happen. They only happen like 1% of the time or something like that. That's why it's called an exception. So we are going to say, when we say at throws, we're saying we are going to throw an unexpected value exception if the new profile ID is not an integer. In other words, if they pass us some sort of junk that really makes no sense, we're going to say, hey, I am not going to accept this new profile ID. Again, this may sound kind of micromanaging, may sound a little tedious. However, we're using encapsulation to enforce a very high level security and prevent people from contaminating our data. And so that's why we're throwing exceptions here, and that's why we're going to take we'll go to all this trouble to make sure that only integers get in there. All right, so there's the empty method. Public, again, the encapsulation level. Function, keyword. Set profile ID is the method name. New profile ID is the parameter that we were talking about here in the doc block, and now here it actually exists. And then braces. So the first thing I'm going to do is use a very extremely useful function called filter var. Now filter var is PHP's function to basically do a lot of canned verification of data for you, so you don't have to do all the hard work and do all the dirty work of does this look like an integer? You don't have to be scratching your head of how to program that manually. You can just use something called filter var, which will do it for you. So filter var takes in two arguments. First of all, the first argument is what are we filtering? What are we verifying? What are we sanitizing? In this case, it's the new profile ID. It's the new profile ID. Now, the second thing we put in is what type of filter are we putting? Now, there are dozens and dozens of filters you can put. I'm using filter validate int, which basically says leave it alone if it's an integer, but if it wasn't, let me know. Now, if you look at the PHP documentation, which is linked from this video, you can read the full documentation for filter. Okay. Well, we've used it, now we're going to verify it. Now, if you read the documentation, you'll see that filter var will return a false if it turned out that the new profile ID was full of trash. So that's what I'm going to test for right here. If the new profile ID was false, I've got trash. I've got trouble. So if I'm in trouble, I'm going to throw a new unexpected value exception. And I'll put a comment here. So I'm going to throw a new unexpected value exception saying profile ID is not a valid integer. In other words, if filter var fails it, I'm throwing the exception. However, if filter var passes it, I move on. So assuming that I passed, what I can do is this. So what this line of code does says, this profile ID is assigned to int_val new profile ID. Let's take it from the left side and then go to the right. The left side, remember this, I already talked about that. This is essentially, I'm working within my own object and I'm pointing to myself. So I'm looking at myself and then looking at my profile ID. So look at myself as a whole, then look at a certain part. And so I was looking at the profile ID. All right, then we're going to assign that to int_val. Int_val is probably a redundancy here, but safe. That will convert it to an integer. Filter var already said that, well, this looks like an integer. It's integer-ish. Int_val pretty much enforces this will be an integer. It'll take anything and convert it to an integer and then store it. And from there, we're done. It's only a few lines of code, but it does an awful lot. So I'll go ahead and label this again. Right here, you could just think of this as cleanup. Make sure profile ID is clean. Make sure it's happening. And right here, this is a save. This is like, you know, I've done all this hard work at the cleanup. I've spent all this time cleaning up. It looks good to me, so I'm going to save it. So that's the idea hit there. Now we have 6 more methods to write. You're going to find that there's not going to be a lot new. It's going to be a lot of repetition in the other 6 methods. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and code them out and post the code on the web page, and then we'll come back. Okay, I went offline and wrote all the other accessor and mutator methods. You'll find that the same pattern will repeat, but I'll go ahead and review them real fast and bring this video to a close. So for the user ID, it was an integer, just like profile ID, so we had to use the same verification. We just made sure it was an integer. And filter var will validate whether it was an integer or not. And if it didn't validate, it returns false, and that means we're in trouble. And so we're going to throw an exception if we get in trouble. And we'll just convert and store the profile ID. Let's see, an accessor for the first name. All we're going to do is return the first name. Pretty simple. Now the first name was not an integer, it was a string. And so to set a first name, we had to do something a little different. We use filter var again, and we put in the new first name. Okay, so far so good. But now look what we're doing. Filter sanitized string. Filter sanitized string. What it does is it's the same thing as the analog that we just used up above with the integers, but now it works on strings instead of working on integers. But you have to notice one thing. There's no conversion step at the last step. There's no need to convert a string to, well, a string. So the conversion step is redundant. We don't even bother. The filter step does clean out any attack vectors or any kind of malformed stuff that we don't want to see. But it doesn't really do any conversion. It's just not necessary. Now, we're going to rinse and repeat one more time for last name. So we have an accessor method for the last name. And we're going to just return the last name and give it back. That way you can have it. And then finally, we have the set last name, which is, again, the same thing. We're going to filter it using filter sanitized string, and filter sanitized string works on strings. And it basically checks for attack vectors and, you know, bad stuff that attackers would use to kind of get to our data. PHP's pretty smart at getting rid of that stuff, and if it finds it, it'll give us a false, and we'll go ahead and throw an exception. Then we'll go ahead and store the last name. So this code is going to be posted here on the site for all to see. And in the next video, we are going to extend this class and expand upon it and add new methods, namely the constructor method and the toString method. We'll discuss what they are and how. Thank you for watching this video, and join us for the next one to add the constructor and the toString method.